Hey, so today's video lecture is going to talk about Mrs. Dalloway, which is the longest text by far that we're reading for week 6A reading list on World War I and its aftermath. This is also a novel that this is the aftermath part of the World War I and its aftermath. So all of the poems that we've read have been from World War I poets writing during the war. Virginia Woolf writes Mrs. Dalloway after the war, and she's reflecting or looking at a society in the 1920s that's really shaped in the post-war period. And we can see this especially with this sort of pervasive sense of trauma throughout the novel, and especially in the character of Septimus Smith. So to start out with a little bit about Virginia Woolf. Woolf was one of the most important modernists. She's one of the people who helped sort of create and bring to prominence what we call stream of consciousness writing, which is sort of grounded in psychoanalysis, grounded in Freudian psychology, and these sort of notions about the unconscious mind and dream visions and things like this. And stream of consciousness essentially is about trying to put on paper the way that the human mind works. So it involves random connections, it involves memory connections where you move, like at the very beginning of Mrs. Dalloway, we move from her thinking about the fact that she needs to buy flowers to her childhood home in the English countryside where flowers were abundant. So we have these connections where different ideas, specific ideas, lead to different ideas that may not sort of immediately connect with the situation that one is in. Questions, divergences, tangents, and things like this are all mirrored in stream of consciousness writing. And Virginia Woolf is one of the best at this. She, along with James Joyce in his novels like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, which are way more complicated and way more difficult and inaccessible than Virginia Woolf, these two are the artists who really bring stream of consciousness to a major public, a major reading public. But Mrs. Dalloway is about dealing with the trauma of World War I. And so, again, a lot of this is grounded in sort of Freudian psychoanalysis, because during the war, there's a widespread experience of what they called shell shock, which we would now call PTSD. And so, but what Woolf does here in this novel that's so interesting is she extends that traumatic experience, which we've seen also in some of the World War I poetry, she extends that to the home front, so that Clarissa Dalloway is in the same kind of space of uncertainty, the same kind of space of suffering and trauma that characters like Septimus Smith are, people who have been actually in combat. So we've got these sort of parallel currents of psychological uncertainty, of sort of compromised ways of looking at the world, compromised ideologies. And again, a lot of this goes back to the modernist crisis, this fundamental modernist crisis where the pillars of civilization and the things that were supposed to keep people civilized, the things that were supposed to sort of help maintain European culture, help maintain certainty and things like this. These things have all been eroded by World War I, and so that's the trauma for Clarissa Dalloway. I mean, she spends an entire day sort of preparing for this party, but she's struggling with this almost existential crisis where she's not sure ultimately why the party matters. She's not sure what the point of doing it is in this sort of post-World War I world. We have similar questions cropping up for Septimus Smith, who is a shell-shocked veteran who, I mean, he suffers throughout the book from hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, and we get this very uncaring or unhelpful sort of medical community who more or less dismisses his concerns. And so part of this connects with Woolf's critique of the medical community, because she herself suffered from long bouts of depression. We think now she probably had bipolar disorder, and she attempted to kill herself several times before finally succeeding in 1941. And so Woolf had a lot of psychological issues, and so she would be in a very sort of good first-hand position to be critical of the English medical establishment and the way that it attempted to deal with people with psychological problems or psychological disorders. And so ultimately, when Septimus Smith kills himself at the end of the novel, this is, in a way, Woolf's sort of wish fulfillment moment. But it's also, I mean, in a non-realist novel or a non-naturalist novel, because it's stream of consciousness, this is a sort of realistic critique of the insufficient healthcare conditions of post-war Britain for veterans who were coming back and who were shell-shocked. The other thing that I wanted to say about shell shock and sort of Freudian psychoanalysis in this. Freud really started studying, again, the conditions we would now know as PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or post-traumatic stress disorder, shortly after World War I, because people were coming back, and it was the first time we'd seen sort of widespread psychological trauma in soldiers. There had been individual cases of it, but there had never been psychological trauma on the scale that there was after World War I. And so Freud and other psychoanalysts started studying this phenomenon. And the reason that Virginia Woolf would have been so familiar with this was because she was a member of the Bloomsbury Group, a founding member of the Bloomsbury Group, which was a key sort of group of modernist artists in London, visual artists, writers, economists, art critics, social critics, things like this. And one of the members of this group was James Strachey, who's produced the standard edition of Freud's works in English. So Woolf would have been quite familiar with the ideas of Freud because ideas like dream analysis, the unconscious, shell shock, the pleasure principle, things like this. These were circulating in Woolf's immediate intellectual circle. So, I mean, Mrs. Dalloway is very much a novel that explores these psychological conflicts, and she does so from a position that's informed by psychoanalysis, but she also does so from a position that reflects her own experience of post-war Britain. So her own experience as a person struggling with depression or bipolar disorder, her own experience as someone who was on the home front in World War I, her own experience as a modernist artist struggling with the sort of crisis of meaning, and her own experience knowing and dealing with veterans who had come back from World War I traumatized by the experience. So we've got a lot of stuff going on here in Woolf's novel. It's an extremely complex novel, but for my money, it's one of the best. Probably, I would actually say it's the best modernist novel. The competitors, again, would probably be Ulysses by James Joyce, but Mrs. Dalloway is much more accessible and much more understandable than Joyce. So even though he may be sort of technically more savvy, perhaps, I think Woolf is the best modernist novelist.